Millionaire widower takes his blind daughter to the zoo until a black nanny changes her life. "Daddy, why is that lady yelling at the girl?" whispered Emma, her little hands squeezing Thomas's tighter as they walked through the penguin area of the Chicago Zoo. The scene unfolding a few feet away was enough to make any decent person feel embarrassed. A middle-aged woman, weighed down with expensive jewelry and carrying that air of superiority that only old money could buy, was yelling at a young African-American woman who was gently holding the hand of a little blonde girl. "I don't pay a fortune for my granddaughter to frequent the same spaces as people like you," the woman sneered, her sharp voice echoing throughout the area. "You have your own places to go, don't you think?" Thomas Harrison, CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country, felt that familiar twinge in his stomach. At 35, widowed for 2 years, he had learned that the world could be cruel in unimaginable ways. But seeing this happen in front of his 8-year-old daughter, who had lost her sight in the car accident that had also claimed her mother, was more than he could bear in silence. The young nanny maintained her composure with impressive dignity. "Ma'am, I'm just taking care of Lily as I always do. We're not bothering anyone." "Bothering?" The woman laughed dismissively. "Your mere presence here is a nuisance. People like you don't know their place in society." Emma tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, she's being mean to the pretty lady. I can tell she's sad." Since losing her sight, Emma had developed a remarkable sensitivity to emotions in people's voices. Even without sight, she could perfectly sense the injustice unfolding before her. Thomas watched the young nanny for a moment. There was something about her that intrigued him. Despite the humiliation, she stood tall, almost as if she had expected it. Her eyes showed no surprise, only a quiet determination that made Thomas wonder if there was more to her story. The woman continued her prejudiced tirade when suddenly the little blonde girl broke free from the nanny's hand and ran toward the penguins. "Lily, no!" shouted the nanny, sprinting after the child who was heading dangerously close to the enclosure. With an agile and precise movement, she reached Lily just as the girl stumbled, saving her from a fall that could have been fatal. But in doing so, she slipped herself, falling hard on the wet ground and completely dirtying her uniform. The crowd that had gathered watched in silence. The wealthy woman, seeing her granddaughter safe in the nanny's arms, showed not a shred of gratitude. Instead, she snapped, "Now look what you've done. You can't even take care of a child without causing a scene. People like you should never be responsible for our children." It was then Thomas noticed something that made him freeze. The nanny looked directly at the woman and smiled, not a smile of submission or embarrassment, but one of confidence, as if she knew something no one else did. "You're right," said the young woman calmly, brushing the mud off her uniform. "People like me really do have a specific place in society." Thomas felt that he had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than an argument at the zoo. There were secrets in that exchange of glances, and his business intuition, honed by years of closing million-dollar deals, told him this nanny was not at all what she appeared to be. If this story of injustice and second chances touched you, as much as it touched me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next proved that people are not always what they seem, and sometimes true revenge comes from where we least expect it. In the days following that encounter, at the zoo, Thomas couldn't get the scene out of his head. There was something about the way the young nanny reacted that stayed with him, like when you know you've forgotten something important but can't quite remember what it is. Emma noticed her father's distraction during dinner that night. "Daddy, you're thinking about the lady at the zoo, aren't you?" she asked, her little hands playing with her fork. "How did you know?" Thomas smiled, impressed once again by his daughter's perception. "Because you're quiet in a different way when you're worried about people. It's not the same as when you're quiet about work." Thomas chuckled softly. Since the accident that took her sight, Emma had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions through subtle signs others would never notice. It was as if losing her vision had sharpened all her other senses. "She wasn't like the other nannies I've seen," Emma continued. "There was something special about her voice, I don't know. Like she was much smarter than," she led on. Later, Thomas overheard part of a conversation. "Jasmine, I've told you not to give Lily extravagant ideas," scolded the older woman, who Thomas now recognized as Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, matriarch of one of Chicago's most traditional families. "People like you need to understand there are limits to what you can teach our children." The nanny, apparently named Jasmine, kept her serene posture. "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. I only helped Lily with her math homework as you requested." "I don't want you putting ideas about college in her head," Mrs. Ashworth snapped. "Lily will attend the same institutions our family has always attended. She doesn't need inappropriate inspiration." Thomas felt his blood boil. That woman was basically saying Jasmine had no right to inspire anything beyond servitude. But Jasmine just smiled again. That same intriguing smile Thomas had noticed before. "You're right, ma'am. Everyone should know their place in society." But there was something in the way Jasmine said it that made Thomas pay closer attention. It didn't sound like submission. It sounded like someone who knew exactly where she belonged, and that perhaps her place was very different from what Mrs. Ashworth imagined. That night, Thomas did something he rarely did. He researched the Ashworth family online. What he found helped him understand that woman's arrogance. The Ashworths owned one of the largest private school chains in the country, in addition to having investments in several other sectors. Victoria Ashworth, in particular, was known for her rigid family traditions and for maintaining an extremely closed social circle. But it was the next day that things became truly interesting. Thomas was in a meeting with investors when his assistant knocked nervously on the door. "Mr. Harrison, there's a young woman here who says she has a business proposal. I wouldn't normally interrupt, but she specifically mentioned the inclusive education project you've been developing." Thomas frowned. The inclusive education project was personal to him, inspired by Emma's experiences. He was creating technologies to make education more accessible for children with disabilities, but he hadn't made the project public yet. "Send her in." When the door opened, Thomas nearly fell out of his chair. It was Jasmine, the nanny from the zoo. But now she wasn't in uniform. She wore an elegant blazer, carried a leather briefcase, and her posture was entirely different. "Mr. Harrison," she said, extending her hand with a professional smile. "My name is Jasmine Carter, and I believe we have a lot to talk about." The investors exchanged confused glances, but Thomas gestured for her to continue. "I have a PhD in special education from Harvard University," Jasmine began, taking papers from her briefcase. "And I've been following your work for some time, especially after I learned you're the father of a visually impaired child." Thomas felt as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. "How do you know about Emma?" "Because I make a point of learning about the people I intend to do business with," Jasmine replied with a calm smile. "And because, coincidentally, I work for a family that frequents the same places you do." That's when Thomas finally understood. "You really are the Ashworth's nanny." "Temporarily," Jasmine said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "You see, Mr. Harrison, sometimes we need to place ourselves in specific positions to truly understand how the world works. And what I discovered while working for the Ashworths was enlightening." She opened her folder and laid out documents that made Thomas's throat tighten. They were contracts, emails, and recordings, evidence of how the Ashworth family had discriminated against employees, students, and entire families at their schools. "Mrs. Victoria Ashworth has no idea who really works for her," Jasmine continued. "She hired me through an agency without doing a proper background check. All she saw was a young black woman in need of work, and she assumed I was limited." Thomas was speechless. "You deliberately infiltrated her home." "I prefer to say I accepted a very valuable field research opportunity." Jasmine smiled. "And now, Mr. Harrison, I have a proposal that could benefit both of our goals. Thomas looked around at the investors. They were captivated by the unfolding revelation. He realized he had underestimated Jasmine just as Victoria Ashworth had. What kind of proposal? He asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. The kind of proposal that will make Victoria Ashworth realize she underestimated the wrong person, and one that will ensure no child, like Emma, is ever deprived of the opportunities she deserves because of prejudice disguised as tradition. Her voice was low, but filled with determination. A chill ran down Thomas's spine. He knew he was witnessing the start of something far greater than personal revenge. Jasmine Carter had turned months of humiliation into a war strategy. The battle ahead wouldn't just change the Ashworths' lives, it could reshape the entire educational system they represented. 2 weeks after that fateful meeting, Thomas was in his office when he received an unexpected call. "Mr. Harrison, this is Detective Rodriguez from the Chicago Civil Rights Department. We've received an anonymous tip about discriminatory practices at Ashworth schools. Would you like to talk to us?" Thomas glanced at Jasmine, who sat across from him with a discreet smile. She had kept her word. The authorities were already investigating. "Of course, Detective. When would be convenient?" Meanwhile, Victoria Ashworth sat in her luxurious office, oblivious to the storm brewing. She had just fired 3 more employees, all black, citing cultural inadequacy for her institutions. "Jasmine seems to be behaving better lately," Victoria remarked to her assistant. "Maybe she's finally learned her place." What Victoria didn't know was that Jasmine had discreetly installed small recorders throughout the house. Every prejudiced comment, every humiliating order, every discriminatory phone call was being meticulously documented. Thomas decided to test the waters. He called Victoria directly, introducing himself as a CEO interested in enrolling Emma, his visually impaired daughter, into one of the Ashworth schools. Victoria's voice grew tense. "On the other end, Mr. Harrison, our institutions maintain very specific standards. We don't have the appropriate structure for that kind of special situation." "I see," Thomas said calmly. "And what kind of situation do you consider appropriate?" "Well," Victoria replied stiffly, "our students come from traditional families with values similar to ours. Children who fit naturally into our academic environment of excellence." Thomas recorded every word. Victoria had just confessed to discrimination against children with disabilities on a recorded call. That evening, Thomas received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Marcus Williams, a civil rights attorney, and Jasmine's former Harvard classmate. He had flown in from New York specifically to review the case. "Thomas, what you've gathered here is pure dynamite," Marcus said, leafing through the evidence. "We're not just talking about a few inappropriate statements. This is a systematic pattern of discrimination that goes back decades." Dr. Williams had represented similar cases against other elite institutions and knew exactly how to proceed. "With this documentation, we can not only expose the discrimination, but also force permanent structural changes." Emma, who was playing with her toys in the corner, looked up. "Daddy, why do you talk so much about the mean lady at the zoo?" Thomas crouched down next to his daughter. "We're trying to get her to stop being mean to other people, sweetheart. And will you succeed?" Thomas looked at Jasmine and Marcus. "Yes, Emma, we will succeed." The following week, Victoria made the mistake that would seal her fate. During a meeting with school parents, she made even more explicit comments about maintaining appropriate racial standards and avoiding the inappropriate mixing of social classes. What she didn't know was that 3 parents at the meeting were actually undercover investigators working with Thomas and his team. "You know, Thomas," Jasmine said one night as they organized the latest evidence, "there's something almost poetic about all this. Victoria always said people like us need to know our place in society." "And what is your place?" Thomas asked, curious. Jasmine smiled in that enigmatic way he now knew so well. At the top of Harvard's graduation list, in the front row of social change, and now at the center of an investigation that will rewrite how institutions like hers operate. Thomas realized in that moment that Victoria Ashworth had underestimated not only Jasmine, but an entire network of highly qualified people who were done tolerating discrimination disguised as tradition. At the end of that week, Thomas received a phone call that made him smile for the first time in months. "Mr. Harrison, this is Detective Rodriguez again. We have enough material to move forward with formal charges. The operation will take place on Monday." Thomas looked out the office window, where Emma played in the garden with the carefree confidence of a child who knew she was protected. In just a few days, Victoria Ashworth would discover she had chosen the wrong people to humiliate. Jasmine appeared at his office door with a folder in her hand, and that familiar smile Thomas now recognized as the harbinger of something extraordinary. "Ready for the final phase?" she asked. Thomas nodded, feeling a mixture of anxiety and satisfaction. After weeks of careful preparation, he was about to show Victoria Ashworth that underestimating the right people could cost her far more than she ever imagined. For a moment, when everything seemed perfectly aligned for justice to triumph, Thomas couldn't imagine that Victoria had one last ace up her sleeve, something that would test not only his plan, but also his determination to protect Emma from a world still resistant to the truth, that real excellence knows no color, origin, or physical limitations. On Monday morning, Victoria Ashworth woke up as she always did, confident, powerful, and completely oblivious to the fact that her life was about to unravel publicly. She ate her breakfast in the garden of her Lake Forest mansion, leafing through the local newspapers as she mentally prepared for the school board meeting that afternoon. Rumors had circulated that a few troublesome parents wanted to question admission policies, but Victoria wasn't worried. She had controlled that board for 15 years. "Jasmine," she called toward the kitchen, "get Lily's school uniform ready and make sure she doesn't interact with those unsuitable children during recess." Jasmine appeared in the doorway wearing the same submissive posture Victoria had learned to appreciate. "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. By the way, you received a call from the Chicago Tribune. They want an interview about your contributions to traditional education." Victoria smiled with satisfaction. Finally, the recognition she deserved. "Excellent. Schedule it for this afternoon after the board meeting." What Victoria didn't know was that at that very moment, in 3 different locations across the city, a coordinated operation was being executed with military precision. Thomas sat in his conference room with Dr. Marcus Williams, Detective Rodriguez, and 6 other civil rights attorneys. On the table were stacks of evidence organized into folders, marked with dates and times. "Timing is crucial," Marcus explained. "The federal investigation will be announced at 2 p.m. during the board meeting. By 2:15, reporters will have received all the recordings. At 2:30, the prosecutor will present the formal charges." Detective Rodriguez confirmed over radio. "Teams in position. Search and seizure warrants ready for execution." That same morning, Victoria arrived at Ashworth School's headquarters with her usual confidence. The glass and marble building, built with decades of profits from discriminatory practices, had never looked more imposing. At exactly 2 p.m., Victoria sat in her presidential chair at the board table, surrounded by 5 other members. All white, all wealthy, all carefully selected to never question her authority. "The first item on the agenda," Victoria began, "is the review of admission policies that some less informed parents have recently questioned." It was at that moment that Detective Rodriguez entered the room, accompanied by 2 federal agents and a bailiff. "Mrs. Ashworth," the detective's voice cut through the air like a knife, "you are under formal investigation for civil rights violations, systematic discrimination, and educational fraud under federal jurisdiction." The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet, but she tried to maintain her composure. "This is absurd," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." The detective placed a small tape recorder on the table. "Do you recognize your own voice, ma'am?" The recording began to play, crystal clear and unmistakable. "I don't pay a fortune for my granddaughter to attend the same spaces as people like you. You have your own places to go." The board members looked at each other with growing panic. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "That was taken out of context," she protested, but her voice sounded desperate. The detective played another recording, this time of the phone conversation with Thomas. "Our students come from traditional families with values similar to ours. Children who fit naturally into our environment of excellence." And then another. "I don't want you putting ideas about college in her head. Lily will attend the same institutions our family has always attended. She doesn't need inappropriate inspirations." Each recording was like a brick being removed from the foundation of her life. Victoria realized with growing horror that there were dozens of them. "How did you get these?" she whispered, though deep down she already knew the answer. At that moment, the door opened again. Jasmine entered, but not as the submissive Nanny Victoria thought she knew. She wore an elegant blazer and carried a leather briefcase, accompanied by Thomas and Dr. Marcus Williams. "Allow me to properly reintroduce myself," Jasmine said with a smile that sent chills down Victoria's spine. "Dr. Jasmine Carter, Ph.D. in special education from Harvard University, expert in institutional discrimination, and for the past 6 months, your undercover employee." Victoria stared at her as if she were seeing a ghost. You completely deceived me." "No," Jasmine replied calmly. "You deceived yourself. You saw a young black woman in need of work and assumed I was intellectually limited. Your own preconceptions blinded you to who I really was." Dr. Williams opened his briefcase and began distributing documents. "These are copies of the evidence that will be presented to the federal grand jury. 6 months of recordings documenting systematic discrimination, internal emails proving deliberate racist policies, and testimonies from dozens of families who were harmed." Victoria looked around the room seeking support, but the other board members were too busy trying to distance themselves from her. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice now clearly desperate. "My family built these institutions. We have traditions, standards." "Traditions of discrimination," Thomas interrupted, speaking for the first time. "Standards of prejudice, and now, consequences." The detective handed over the search and seizure warrants. "All computers, files, and financial documents from Ashworth schools are being confiscated for forensic analysis. The school's operations are suspended pending federal investigation." Victoria tried to stand, but her legs failed her. 15 years of absolute power, a lifetime of unquestioned privilege, crumbling in a matter of minutes. "My reputation," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "My family. Our lineage." "Your reputation," Dr. Williams said emotionlessly, "is now that of a convicted civil criminal. And your lineage will be remembered as an example of how systematic prejudice ultimately meets justice." At that moment, Victoria's cell phone began ringing incessantly. Journalists, socialites, business partners, everyone wanted answers about the headlines already spreading across the country. Jasmine approached the table where Victoria still sat, paralyzed. "Remember when you told me that people like me need to know our place in society?" Victoria nodded weakly. "Well," Jasmine said with quiet dignity, "now you know what my place really is, and what yours is." Thomas watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. The woman who had humiliated a brilliant young scholar, who had denied opportunities to innocent children, who had built an empire on prejudice disguised as tradition, now faced the reality of consequences. But as Victoria Ashworth realized her downfall was only the beginning of an investigation that would uncover decades of injustice, One question hung in the air. Could justice, however satisfying, truly repair the damage done to so many families? 6 months after Victoria Ashworth's spectacular fall, Thomas sat in his new office looking at the headlines still echoing across the nation. Chicago. Tribune. Former elite school principal sentenced, 5 years in prison for systematic discrimination. Victoria didn't just lose her freedom. She lost her assets, confiscated to compensate the families she had harmed. She lost her social circle. No one in high society wanted to be seen near a convicted civil criminal. And worst of all, she lost what she had valued most, her reputation. Her once flawless image had become a national example of how prejudice disguised as tradition finally meets justice. "Daddy, did you see? 3 more families enrolled in our school today," Emma said as she entered the office with that radiant confidence only truly happy children possess. Children with and without disabilities now learned side by side, breaking down barriers that institutions like Ashworth Schools had spent decades building. At 9 years old, Emma had become the school's unofficial ambassador. Her ability to see beyond appearances inspired other children with disabilities to never underestimate their own potential. "Dr. Carter is in the conference room with the investors from San Francisco," Emma continued. "They want to open 5 more schools next year." Jasmine had become one of the most respected educators in the country. Her book on undercover work to combat institutional discrimination was being used in university courses, and her TED Talks had racked up millions of views. That afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected call. It was Detective Rodriguez with an update on Victoria. "She lost her final appeal today," he reported. "She'll serve her full sentence, and there's more. Dozens of other families are coming forward with similar cases against the Ashworth network. It seems you've unearthed decades of injustice." Thomas hung up thoughtfully. The revenge they had once sought had transformed into something much bigger, a national movement for educational reform that would benefit thousands of children for generations to come. Later, Emma found him in the garden, sitting on the same bench where they used to have lunch before everything changed. "Dad, do you still think about that mean lady at the zoo?" she asked, settling down beside him. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "But not with anger, with gratitude." "Gratitude?" Emma tilted her head. "Yes. She showed us that the world needed to change, and thanks to her, we were able to make that change happen." Emma smiled in that wise way that always surprised Thomas. "Dr. Carter always says the best revenge is to build something better than what they tried to destroy." Thomas hugged his daughter, looking through the school window at children playing together, children of all colors, some with disabilities, some without, all learning that true excellence knows no artificial barriers. Victoria Ashworth had tried to use her power to perpetuate discrimination. Jasmine Carter used her intelligence to dismantle an entire system of prejudice. And in the end, the woman who once said people like Jasmine should know their place discovered that Jasmine's true place was at the forefront of an educational revolution rewriting the future for thousands of children. The best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so extraordinary that it renders everything they tried to do against you irrelevant. If this story of intelligent justice has inspired you as much as it has inspired me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that sometimes karma just needs a little help from human intelligence.